Growing up in North Dakota, I always heard stories from the elders about the things that live in the woods. Not the kind of things that people like to talk about openly. More like whispered warnings that were only shared when someone went missing or when the air got too still at night. My grandfather, who was deeply connected to the old ways, often spoke of spirits that watched over the land, but he also mentioned darker things, entities that had no place in the world of the living, yet somehow found their way here. It wasn't until I experienced something myself that I realized those stories weren't just meant to keep us out of the woods at night. They were real as the trees that stretch on for miles, and the winds that blow cold over the plains. It happened not long ago, during late autumn, when the first hints of winter were already biting at the air. I'd gone out to the woods to gather some wood, and take in the quiet that only nature can offer. There's something about the northern woods that's different, something old and untamed. You can feel it the second you step into the trees, like the land has a memory, and it doesn't forget the ones who walk there. I'd been walking for maybe an hour, venturing deeper than I normally would, when I noticed the forest around me had gone completely silent. No birds, no wind, no rustling of leaves, just this oppressive stillness that seemed to close in on me. I've been in the woods my whole life, and I know when something's not right, but this was different. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I kept walking, trying to shake off the growing feeling of unease, when I noticed something strange. Up ahead, maybe 50 yards or so, the trees seemed darker, more twisted. Their branches hung low, almost like they were drooping under some unseen weight. I should have turned back right then, but curiosity got the better of me. I needed to see what was going on. As I got closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Scattered among the trees were these strange symbols, carved deep into the bark. They weren't like anything I'd seen before, definitely not natural, and certainly not man-made. They looked old, ancient, and they gave off this unsettling vibe, like they weren't meant to be seen by human eyes. I stood there for a moment, trying to figure out what to do, when I heard something. A low, guttural sound that seemed to come from all around me. It wasn't an animal, I knew that much. It was deeper, more unnatural, like the sound was coming from the earth itself. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but before I could move, I saw it. Emerging from the shadows of those twisted trees was something that defied explanation. It was tall, easily over 7 feet, and covered in a thick matted fur that seemed to blend into the darkness around it. But its face was the stuff of nightmares. It had no eyes, just hollow sockets where eyes should have been, and its mouth was this twisted grin, filled with sharp, jagged teeth. It moved slowly, deliberately, like it wasn't in any rush, but there was a hunger in its movements that made it clear I was its target. My heart was racing, and for a second I thought I was frozen in place. But as it took another step toward me, my body finally kicked into gear. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the forest floor, every breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I could hear it behind me crashing through the underbrush, getting closer with every step. The woods, which had once felt so familiar, now seemed like a maze, the trees pressing in on me from every side. I don't know how long I ran, but it felt like an eternity. Just when I thought my legs were going to give out, I burst into a small clearing. The air was thinner here, and for a moment, the creature's pursuit seemed to stop. I turned around, chest heaving, expecting to see it right behind me, but the clearing was empty. The oppressive silence had returned, but the creature was gone. I didn't waste any time. I kept moving, making my way back to the trail that would lead me out of the woods. Even as I left that twisted part of the forest behind, I could still feel its presence, like it was watching me, waiting for me to come back. When I finally made it home, I was shaken to my core. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I'd seen in the woods wasn't just some wild animal or figment of my imagination. It was something ancient, something that had been here long before us, and it was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next person foolish enough to wander too deep into its territory. I never told anyone what happened that day. Most people wouldn't believe me, and those who did would just say it was one of the old spirits, one of the beings my grandfather used to warn me about. Maybe it was. Or maybe it was something worse, something that doesn't belong in this world at all. I've heard a lot of stories growing up near the forests in North Dakota. Not the kind of stories you'd read about in textbooks or on historical markers, but the kind that gets passed down around campfires, late at night when the wind picks up just enough to make the trees seem alive. Stories from the native tribes in the area. Whispers of things that roam the woods. Things that don't belong in this world. You grow up hearing them, and most people write them off as just that. Stories. But there's something about the way the elders would talk about the forest that never sat right with me. The way their voices would drop, their eyes would shift away like they didn't want to remember what they were saying. Like it wasn't just a story. I didn't think much of it back then. It was just part of the local lore, something to add color to the quiet life out here. I've always been into hiking, exploring, seeing parts of the land most people don't bother with anymore. North Dakota's forests are thick in some places, especially up north where the trees crowd together and form a canopy so dense it's like you're stepping back into another world. And the thing about the forest out here is that it's silent. Too silent. No bird song, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just an oppressive stillness. Like the woods are holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I'm not the type to get easily spooked. I've camped alone, walked through woods at night with just a headlamp, heard the howls of coyotes in the distance without a second thought. But there was one time, not too long ago, when I found myself in a situation that still haunts me. It was early October, and I decided to take a few days off work to go on a solo hiking trip. There's this particular stretch of forest about 60 miles north of Bismarck that I'd been wanting to explore. It's not a tourist spot, not really mapped out for hikers, but that's what drew me to it. Untouched wilderness. I figured I'd spend a couple of days out there, maybe camp for a night or two, then head back once I'd seen enough. The first day was pretty uneventful. I followed a narrow trail, half overgrown but still recognizable as something people had used at some point. I set up camp near a small stream, made a fire, and spent the night listening to the usual sounds of the forest, the crackling of the fire, the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. It wasn't until the second day that things started to feel off. I woke up to a thick fog blanketing the forest, which isn't all that unusual for early mornings in October, but the fog didn't lift. As the day wore on, it only got thicker, swallowing the trees and making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead of me. The air felt heavier too, like the atmosphere was pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. I told myself it was just the weather, maybe a storm rolling in, and pushed forward. The further I went, the worse it got. The forest had this weird, almost unnatural stillness to it. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just the sound of my own footsteps crunching on the undergrowth. After a while, I started to notice something strange. There were these markings on the trees, deep gashes that looked like they'd been made by claws or something sharp, but much too large for any animal I knew of around here. They weren't natural either. They were deliberate, almost like someone or something had been dragging their nails across the bark. I stopped to examine one of the trees, running my fingers over the grooves. They were fresh, no more than a day or two old. That's when I noticed the silence again. No birds, no insects, just this eerie quiet that seemed to stretch on forever. I should have turned back then, but I didn't. I figured maybe it was some pranksters messing around trying to scare off hikers, so I kept going. By mid-afternoon, the fog had thickened to the point where I couldn't see the sun, and the trees around me were just shadows, looming in the gray haze. It was starting to get colder, too, much colder than it should have been for early fall. I pulled my jacket tighter and tried to shake off the growing sense of unease creeping up my spine. At first, I thought it was just another tree, a massive shadow standing still in the distance. But as I moved closer, I realized it wasn't a tree. It was tall, easily over 8 feet, with long, gangly limbs and a hunched posture that made it look almost human, but not quite. Its skin, or fur, I couldn't really tell, was this mottled gray, blending perfectly with the fog. It was facing away from me, but there was something about its shape, the way it stood, that made my blood run cold. I froze, every instinct in my body screaming at me to back away, but I couldn't move. It was like I was rooted to the spot. My eyes locked on this thing as it slowly began to turn. That's when I saw its face, or what I assume was its face. It didn't have eyes, at least none that I could see. Just a flat, featureless surface where eyes should have been. And its mouth. God, its mouth was this wide, gaping hole that stretched unnaturally across its face, filled with sharp, jagged teeth. It didn't make a sound, didn't move any closer, but I could feel it watching me, even without eyes. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I knew I had to get out of there, but I couldn't make myself turn my back on it. I took a step back, then another, keeping my eyes on the thing the whole time. It didn't follow, didn't make any move toward me, but I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive, like it was waiting for something. I don't remember how long it took me to get back to my campsite, but by the time I did, the fog had started to lift. The forest was still eerily quiet, but the sense of being watched had faded. I didn't waste any time packing up my gear and heading back the way I'd come. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching from the shadows, just waiting for me to let my guard down. I made it back to my car by nightfall, the fog completely gone by then, leaving the forest looking almost normal again. But I knew what I'd seen wasn't normal. It wasn't some figment of my imagination or a trick of the light. That thing was real, and it was out there in the woods, waiting for anyone foolish enough to wander too far off the beaten path. I haven't been back to that part of the forest since, and I don't plan on going anytime soon. Whatever that thing was, it didn't belong in this world. It was something ancient, something that had been there long before any of us set foot in those woods, and it's still there, hiding in the fog, waiting for its next victim. Believe what you want, but there are things in the forests of North Dakota that we can't explain, things that the native tribes have been warning us about for generations. I didn't believe them before, but now, I'm not so sure. Sometimes when the wind blows just right, I think I can still hear that awful silence, the sound of the forest holding its breath, and I know, deep down, that it's still out there, waiting. Working as a ranger in North Dakota, I've spent countless days in the woods, patrolling vast stretches of forest that seem untouched by time. My ancestors always spoke of these lands with reverence, warning about the spirits that roamed the trees long before we did. But I never took those stories too seriously. The woods had always been calm, predictable, until that one autumn day when everything changed. It was late October, and the trees were ablaze with red and orange leaves. The air was crisp, the sky a dull gray, signaling the approach of the colder months. I was on a routine patrol, checking a remote section of forest that few hikers ever ventured into. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, until the only sound was the crunch of leaves under my boots. It wasn't the usual peaceful silence of the woods. This quiet was different, oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I stopped by a dried-up creek bed, its rocks scattered haphazardly. That's when I noticed something strange. Large, deep impressions in the earth, far too big to be from any animal I knew. They weren't shaped like bear prints or anything familiar. The edges of the rocks were shattered as though something enormous had passed through, pushing everything aside. A sense of unease crept over me. The air felt thick, almost charged with something I couldn't explain. I stood there staring at the tracks, trying to make sense of them, but the longer I looked, the more wrong they seemed. There was no natural explanation for what I was seeing. I decided to continue, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every few minutes I caught glimpses of movement from the corner of my eye, fleeting shadows among the trees, too quick for me to focus on. It wasn't an animal, not anything I could recognize, and it stayed just out of sight, as though it knew exactly how far to stay to avoid detection. The old cabin, an abandoned shelter once used by hunters, wasn't too far from my location. I figured I could make it there, regroup, and radio in about the strange tracks. But as I approached the cabin, the woods seemed to grow even more oppressive. The trees loomed taller, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground. The cabin was old, decrepit, with its door barely hanging on the hinges. Still, it was shelter. I stepped inside and immediately felt a chill run down my spine. The place smelled damp, like the woods had started to reclaim it. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the air was thick with dust. For a moment, I stood still, trying to collect my thoughts. I needed to figure out what to do next, but the creeping sense of dread kept building, like something was drawing closer. Then, I heard it. Not a growl or moan, but a distant rhythmic sound like something heavy was moving outside, circling the cabin. The steps were deliberate, slow, as though whatever it was knew exactly where I was. My heart raced, and I backed away from the door, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I moved to one of the small windows, just big enough to peek through without being seen. Outside, the forest seemed still, but I could feel it. Something was out there, waiting. And then, through the trees, I saw a flash of movement. It was massive, taller than any bear animal I'd ever seen, moving between the trees with a speed that didn't match its size. I froze, hoping that if I stayed still, whatever it was wouldn't notice me. Minutes passed, and the heavy footsteps faded into the distance, but I didn't feel safe. I knew whatever was out there wasn't gone. It was watching, waiting for the right moment. The cabin wasn't going to keep me safe. I needed to get back to the ranger station, but leaving meant crossing through the same woods where that thing was lurking. I steeled myself, grabbed the radio, and stepped out into the cold air. The woods were silent again, but this time, it felt like the silence was alive. Every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind carried a warning. I started walking, trying to keep my pace steady, but it felt like the trees were closing in on me. The path back seemed longer than it had on the way in, and the feeling of being followed never left. Then, just as I was about to break into a run, I saw it again, this time much closer. It stepped out from behind a tree, towering over me. Its form was obscured by the dim light filtering through the branches, but its size was undeniable. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, we stood there, me frozen in place, and it just watching me. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared back into the woods, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I ran, faster than I ever thought possible, not stopping until I reached the edge of the forest, where the ranger station lights were barely visible in the distance. By the time I reached safety, my legs were burning. My lungs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't care. I had escaped. I didn't know what that thing was, and honestly, I'm not sure I ever want to find out. But one thing's for sure. There's something in those woods, something that doesn't belong. Since that day, I've heard stories from the locals, whispers about creatures that have roamed these lands for centuries, hidden away in the most remote corners of the forest. I never believed them before, but now, I don't think I'll ever look at these woods the same way again.